Okie doke, just a sound check. Can you hear me? Awesome. I'm going to affirm the resolution that it is un-American to take a knee rather than stand during America's national anthem. Let's get two definitions out of the way, then we'll get to a weighing mechanism and a singular argument. The first definition, just so that we know, kneeling, obviously we need to define what it is. We all know what it means. But just the context, we're not talking about people who say have to kneel because, you know, they have a broken leg or something. We're talking about the context of Kaepernick, of intentionally kneeling as a publicity stunt. And contextually too, to protest movements that they feel like are legitimate. Now this is where we get to the important definition. What does it mean to be un-American? The definition here is that we violate cultural tradition. Now what this means is to intentionally stand against a tradition or a norm that a culture or society has that is long-standing. To oppose that is to oppose the culture, because cultures are defined by the symbols and traditions that they create. That's how they form unity with other people. That's literally what it means to have a culture. So to oppose those very traditions would be to oppose that culture. And that'll also be the weighing mechanism. The way we should understand what's un-American and what's pro-American is through America's cultural traditions. There's no other legitimate way to evaluate what it means to be an American, and we'll get to why that is in this argument. The singular argument that I have is that kneeling violates tradition. There's two quick ways to check this. The first is everyone notices when you kneel. Obviously, it goes to reason that people are making a big deal about the kneeling because it's different, right? It's the exact opposite of what people normally do during the national anthem. The second thing here is this is actually enshrined in law. I didn't know this before the round, but there's actually something called the Flag Code, which is something that the Senate updated in 2008. The United States Senate, like our actual government, talked about what the actual symbolic protocol should be when you hear the national anthem, and they say it is to stand and to face the flag if there is one in front of you, and to put your right hand on your heart. And so kneeling, of course, by its omission of the very first thing that you should do at the least, is a violation of the basic tradition. Now, I want to end this speech by giving some predictions. My opponent is likely to offer one of two or both positions. He's either going to say, well, kneeling is actually a good thing, it's not un-American. I just want to say that we can both agree that kneeling is good. I actually think it's really healthy that people are free to be un-American. It's very important that we live in a culture that allows us to disagree with the norms and that allows us to oppose it. If he says something like, well, it's still American, it's still pro-American because it's an exercise of an American right like freedom. Just understand, America's culture does allow for us to choose to oppose the culture. That's the whole point of freedom. Not all exercises of freedom are pro-American. You can use it to oppose the traditions. So because it violates a fundamental tradition that Americans have, it is un-American and should be considered as such.
Okay, great. You can hear me. Just give me a thumbs up. Okay, excellent. So I'm going to flesh out your definition a little bit of American. I think we agree mostly. I would just say that the idea of American principles and ideas and tradition probably are ingrained in the ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I think that when you're evaluating tradition, you also have to uphold the idea that not just if it's something we've historically done, but if it's something that is historically ingrained into the identity of America, if this upholds with our values as well as the tradition. And I'm going to talk about that. So the 3 points I'm going to give after I give some rebuttal. The first one is I'm going to talk about the history of American protests. I'm going to talk about why this is not a new thing, why it is a precedent, and why it actually necessarily isn't opposing the American culture when you are dissenting from a norm. Second, we're going to talk about the way that they protest. It's also going to go into some of that similar territory. And lastly, I'm going to talk about what they protest. So first, let's talk a little bit. He brings up this idea about the flag code and what is normal, what is accepted, what is codified, legally speaking, tradition, etc. I would like to say that first, what is does not equal what ought to be, right? So just because the Senate has passed this resolution of what ought to be considered the symbolic gesture doesn't necessarily mean that embodies American values. I think it also is to recognize that American values often have shifted. The American culture have shifted with the guiding principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I'm going to talk about that historically. If you want to get into technical, the flag being displayed on its side in a giant display on football games, that goes against symbolic flag code, I believe. So if you want to talk about what is traditional and what is un-American, I don't think many people would say displaying the flag in such a way is un-American at a football game. Many people would say it is pretty American. Okay, so let's talk about the history of American protests. I'll probably have to dump some of this argument into my second speech. But when we look at the founding of the United States, it was in dissent. It was in protest, right? So John Adams talked about the Fourth Amendment being the spark that ignited the revolution. That, of course, is the one that has to do with warrantless search and seizure akin to police powers. And what we see Kaepernick and the others are protesting is a lot of these kinds of injustices from the government. And so when we see that not only was that part of the revolution, we see the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a bunch of dudes who didn't like tea. They were protesting the taxation policy on the colonies. We see the Boston Massacre. The Americans were even violent towards soldiers. These are all a part of the founding of the nation. These are ingrained in American identity. It is part of the American tradition to protest. So when you have two competing traditions fighting against each other for American identity, I think you have to weigh which one is more in service of fighting for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You can either say the one that agrees with the government 100% of the time and adheres to symbolic flag code, or the one that helps to try to call out and defend the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness of those who are in a less fortunate position through American descent, which has historically happened.
I just have a quick question. Do you think that communists are un-American?
I would say that their expression of their communist ideas would not be an un-American expression, though the communist idea may be un-American. It's kind of not relevant to the debate.
I'm so sorry. Your sound completely cut out for when I asked that question. My question was, do you think that communists are un-American in their ideas?
I would say that the ideas of communism might be contrary to a lot of American values. I would not say the communist expression of communism is un-American.
Okay. And you're welcome to not answer this question. If you don't, I just want to ask again so we have a good debate, a good discussion. Is it possible to be un-American?
I would say anything that violates these ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the culture would probably consider that.
Great. All right, let's talk about his arguments. First, he's trying to replace, he's not adding to my definition, he's trying to replace it entirely. So I'm saying you should understand what's un-American. In other words, what's this culture versus what the culture establishes through tradition. He says, well, no, we should look at life, liberty, and property. Two responses. First, life, liberty, and property are not American-only concepts. I mean, this is such a poor ethnocentric understanding of how the United States works. We don't just claim that we have like this moral hierarchy and all these things are our values. And some Norwegian dude who lives his life freely is actually pro-America. That's not how it works at all. So life, liberty, and property are moral concepts. They don't define what America is. The second thing is this position is completely regressive. This is an argument you're going to hear me mention a lot more. My opponent is saying that anytime you exercise life, liberty, or property, you're being pro-America. That means literally me standing up freely and saying, hey, I hate America and everything it stands for is an exercise of my free speech and therefore is totally American. My opponent has said, oh, well, yeah, it's possible to be un-American, but you just have to violate one of these three tenets, which leads to my third response, which is opponent saying immorality. My opponent is saying the literal only way to not be pro-American is to kill someone, enslave someone, or steal someone's property. Like, are we seriously going to equate America with basic ethics? I mean, I take issue with this intellectually, like that we pretend America is the same thing as being a good moral person. Like, we're equating this with rights theory, which is just silly. We're talking about whether or not you are for or against the traditions of a culture. That is the most coherent way to understand it, because my opponent's position is aggressive. It becomes impossible to actually resent a culture. You can literally shout at the top of your lungs, I hate America, and that's still an exercise of freedom. I guess we're pro-American then. So my opponent's debate here falls on the fact that he's using the wrong standard. Life, liberty, and property are not what define pro-America versus not pro-America. The second thing he says is, well, the flag might be on the side during the football game. That's not pro-America. My response is no, that's not how it works. Putting the flag upside down intentionally as a show is a violation of flag protocol, but not laying the flag down flat. They literally couldn't stretch out the entire, like, football field size flag in the air. That's why it's on the ground. The last thing he says is protest is American. My response is meaningless. If protest is American, literally protesting all aspects of American culture is pro-America. Can you guys see how meaningless this standard is? If any exercise of freedom that isn't directly immoral is pro-American, then it is literally impossible to not support this country. I think you can absolutely do so, and people kneeling are exemplifying that.
So let's talk about a few things. First of all, if you only go by his definition, you have to say that repeated habits and repeated actions of a country represent their values. I don't think that works. I think that each country does embody values, and whether or not they live up to those values is for disagreement. For instance, if you were to say pro-Iran, a lot of that would have to be embodied in their religious identity, because those are the morals they adhere to. That would be a pro-Iran stance if you were to embody those kinds of things. Anyway, but let's also talk about what a protest for the sake of protesting, I would argue, is an American ideal. But even if you don't want to buy that, you have to recognize that what they protest is what makes it an American protest, right? Silencing people is un-American. Arresting people without cause is un-American. Police killing is un-American. And the reason being that a lot of these reasons why the country was founded, right? So you have to look at the historical nature of why the US was founded. I'm not saying that to be American is to be a good person, but what I am saying is that when you look at the historical roots of this country, reasons why it were founded are important to understand the identity. And so many of these reasons, especially the Fourth Amendment, are why this country was founded. So let's move on. Briefly on hitting more on the history of American protests, I want to mention that we see the norms established upset in multiple ways. So MLK's protests, for instance, for the Jim Crow laws, these were sit-ins in restaurants. They were marches down the streets. Women's suffrage, all of these kinds of protests were for the ideals that this country is founded on, that were enshrined in the Constitution, enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. These are what you have to understand. And these are not traditional truths, right? So like women having the vote was not a traditional thing the US had. He has to concede under his definition that up until it became longer of a year span that women could vote than not, women having the vote is an un-American value. I'm not willing to concede that. So second, let's talk about the way they protest. Again, this is going to bleed a little bit into my next speech. But first of all, while the national anthem can be argued as to not represent the government as the ideals per se or the traditions, disrupting is not a sign of when you disrupt, you're not saying that you hate the country or these ideals or the traditions of America. You might be trying to protest the injustices of the government, right? And so I think what you can't say is that to be an American is to support everything the government does. And I think that goes into his codified symbolic flag thing, right? To disrupt that is not an un-American idea. And so when you look at the way that this is being disrupted, you have to recognize you're protesting a lot of government actions, a lot of police actions, not necessarily values of America. If you're to define Americanism solely on traditions, we should also be defining to be American as to own slaves, to own plantations, to only allow men the vote, those types of things.
One more quick question. If I were to lawfully and legally step forward and protest the existence of America as a nation, would that be un-American or pro-American?
The content that you are saying might be un-American, but the way that you say it, the allowance of your expression is an American feat. So the ideas may be un-American, is American.
All right, let's step into the first overarching argument of morality versus culture. My opponent is trying to appropriate all morality as being part of America. He literally says, yeah, the aspects where you're freely speaking, that's all America's stuff. That's ours. And then says, even though the content you're expressing is directly un-American, somehow the fact you're talking makes it pro-America. It's a blatant contradiction. My second argument is, look at history. My opponent says, yeah, life, liberty, and property, these are the American values that we've championed. I mean, I know I'm going to sound like a flaming college liberal here, and it's ironic because I'm not, but our country was kind of, run by founders who had slaves. It was also made in a country where women couldn't vote. So my opponent's saying, well, yeah, no, these aren't the values of Americans. After all, they were in history, and if we're using history, they would be, is like so circular. He's saying, well, we can't look to their traditions because their traditions are really immoral, which would make the values of America historically really immoral. The whole point is we're doing too much work here. You understand what is pro-American versus not American through their culture and through their traditions. I mean, go to literally any other culture, disrespect their traditions. Say like, I'm trying to think of a random tradition. Like go to, here's a good example. Like go, for example, to Mexico and refuse to ever kiss someone else's face when you greet them. Like constantly refuse to do that. They're going to be offended at that. That's going to be a violation of their cultural norm. You will consider to be not a Mexican if you do that. You're not playing into their culture. We already understand culture in these terms. So again, the big overarching argument is my opponent is conflating morality and culture. Completely ridiculous, because the American culture is profusely immoral. Look at the Trail of Tears. Look at literally everything that we did to the slaves. I'm not saying it's like always bad. I'm not trying to make you hate America, but to say that morality and American culture are identical is historically wrong, definitionally wrong, and it's also completely regressive. I mean, this is the whole point. We get down to it. My opponent is literally saying that someone standing up and saying, I hate America, is actually pro-American because they're using their freedom. I mean, the whole position itself is regressive, which leads us back to the main argument. Understand culture through its tradition and through its norms. To violate those norms, to directly kneel when the anthem is being played, is a violation of not just the codified flag code, but it's a violation of what the American culture prefers to have. So let's not distract the debate with slavery. Let's focus on the issues. To directly do the opposite of what our culture does with the flag is not part of that culture. There's no other way that you can disrupt and garner more attention than by doing something that is so obviously not pro-American.
So don't buy his chronological snobbery, right? He tells you that everything historically that the founders did was immoral, and then wants to tell you that we should judge this by the traditions and by what we've traditionally done as American values. I don't think owning slavery is an American value, right? Just because we failed on some of those ideals doesn't invalidate the ideals or make that those ideals didn't found the nation, right? So we've constantly reevaluated our identity as Americans and figured out what it does it mean to be an American, and it means liberating slaves. It means giving women the right to vote, those types of things. Okay, so don't buy his idea that I'm conflating morality. For instance, I would not say that proposing a monarchical system, monarchy for the United States, is an American ideal, because that's not one of the ideas that this nation was founded on, right? But the ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are. And whether they were lived up to perfectly historically or not does not mean that those ideals are not American. It means that we are constantly reevaluating and becoming and growing into our identity and holding this out. Okay, let's keep talking about the way that they protest, right? So a lot of these ideals are not disrupted in this kneel. It's a peaceful protest. So you're protesting for civil rights, you're disrupting the culture in a sense, but you're not actually violating anyone else's rights. You're not harming anyone, you're not bringing any harm to the nature of America. All you are doing is calling attention to an issue, right? I think that that's the idea of hurting someone else, the idea of stopping them maybe when would be considered assaulting a culture, but when you're not even doing anything that's violent, when you're not disrupting in that sense, it's kind of hard to see why that hurts a culture or why it goes against an identity. And lastly, just to briefly mention, Kaepernick and Reed, who started this protest, also got the idea of kneeling from Special Forces veteran Green Beret Nate Boyer, as an idea to respect troops, to respect the protectors of the freedoms, protectors of the border, protectors of the identity of America in a lot of ways, because the U.S. has a unique identity in the world stage. It's not completely unique from other countries, but it is a strong one. And so these people protect that identity. This was the action itself was taken as a form of respect to those people, right? So even to argue that to oppose the government might be un-American on the grounds that you're disrespecting the troops who keep this country alive, that's not even going to be a relevant point if he tries to bring that up, because of the fact that this was a symbol that was kept in mind the soldiers in that way. So I'll get on to my third point about what they protest and why that's important and why what they stand up for matters, why that embodies American ideals, right? So why it necessarily can't be tradition only that dictates what an American identity is, and how these things actually feed into protecting the American identity, protecting what it means to be an American.
Okay, so my opponent has no warrants on why being free and having life and property are strictly American culture. His only warrant is that's what we were founded on. When I pointed out historically, actually, we were founded on a lot of other things, like the subjugation of other races and Indians and colonialism. He's like, oh, well, that's not us. Like, yes, we were also founded on that, but no, not it. And he also pretty much drops the argument because he's spending the vast majority of his speech on actual good case arguments, that it's peaceful. So we're going to spend most of our time on those. Just remember the overarching argument of first, morality versus culture. Morality says, what do we want culture to be? My argument about tradition says, what is culture? So yeah, he's talking about maybe the ideal culture for America, what he wants it to be. I'm talking about what it currently is. Traditions, like how we respect the flag and respond to it, those are purely American values. Those are purely American traditions, and there's not some ambiguity here on how to react to the flag. No one's second guessing, like, I don't know, do we stand, do we like plank? No one's guessing. Everyone already knows. Okay, let's get down to his argument first. It's peaceful. My response is no impact. So who cares? You can peacefully not be an American. You can peacefully oppose American traditions. My opponent's argument ends with this: you literally cannot oppose American tradition if you're using freedom. That's his first. That's what he first steps do, and then says, well, it's peaceful, so it can't be anti-American. Look, you can peacefully not support American ideas. We have free speech. Free speech is fine. You can use that to oppose the tradition. And lastly, he says, well, it was also maybe used to raise awareness for the troops. My response is contextual. Look, we're looking at the context of Kaepernick as he's distracting from the national anthem to raise awareness to a bigger issue. I actually think what he's doing is probably fine. I think it's great that he's able to bring awareness to an issue, but let's not confuse ourselves. This is a violation of the norm. It's a violation of what American tradition has codified literally into law. And there's no argument saying, yeah, it's totally pro-American to deviate and do the exact opposite of what everyone has been doing for the flag for decades.
So I'm excited to hear why everything that taking a knee is like un-American, other than it defies like a government norm. Like I don't think he's given you one like, oh, there's a codified symbolic gesture and we've done it historically. I think that I've proven to you that you can't base things historically on that, right? So I'm not saying these ideals are uniquely American. I'm saying that these are the ideals that Americans look to when we try to reevaluate, when we try to make laws, when we try to make decisions. These are the kinds of ideas that we find ourselves looking to when we are Americans, that we try to embody when we make policy. So just because people didn't embody it perfectly in the past doesn't mean that these aren't the ideals that we try to embody. So again, everything that he tells you about the bad parts of America's founding, take that a point against him, because he's telling you that traditionally these are the things that make you American. And I'm telling you that traditionally the ideals that maybe weren't always lived up to, but can be, are what make you an American. Okay, lastly, let's talk about what they protest. I think I win this argument regardless of what they protest, but we'll talk about why what they protest is American. Okay, let's talk about the drug war. The drug war is looking, we look at reports from the ACLU, from the federal government, and we see that Black Americans are 4 times more likely to be arrested for smoking marijuana, in spite of statistically similar rates for marijuana use between whites and blacks, right? We see federal government programs incentivizing raids in poor areas and African-American areas in order to get the numbers up so that they can get profit. We think that this hurts Black Americans disproportionately. We think this violates, again, a lot of the ideas of Americanism, of equality of man. Whether or not those were lived up to historically or not, we think that these are ideas that we need to embody now, and that these are what we need to build our identity on, is equality, right? We also see laws about crack and cocaine, where crack at one point was 100 times larger of a penalty than the same amount of cocaine, even though crack is more prevalent in Black areas. We see examples of police brutality, right? We see the case of Eric Garner selling cigarettes on the street, put into a chokehold by the police in an illegal move, and killed despite saying, "I can't breathe." Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old with a pellet gun, shot by officers after they drove up closely to him, even though he was trying to show them it was a real gun. And even if you don't buy that the injustice of these situations because of heat of the moment, you can look at Khalif Boder, who was accused of stealing a backpack, was held for 3 years without trial, often in solitary confinement, and ended up committing suicide because of it. We think these violate the principal amendments, the constitution of the government foundation, the ideals that the government was founded on, right? The founding documents are the closest thing that we have to an initial principle argument, and so you have to look to these principles. We can see all of these examples of police brutality, inequality in the government, are not American ideals, because America strove to be treated equally under the law. Taxation without representation was a matter of equality under the law under the Brits. And so I think when you look at these historically, these ideals line up with what they are protesting. And I have some more examples in my closing speech.
Okay. Let's first address the elephant in the room. Nothing about Black crime rates or police crime rates have anything to do with whether or not kneeling is un-American or pro-American. There's no link to those whatsoever. So the easiest no impact response here is it's irrelevant. Look, this contradiction doesn't, like, it is a contradiction, but it doesn't even matter. He's saying, well, we can't base this on history and what we've done before, except for his first speech where he says America was built on freedom. Like, the contradiction is just glaring. I don't even need it to be patronizing for me to continually emphasize it. But I think what is important to emphasize is the argument that I made earlier about ideal culture versus current culture. My opponent talks about America in these grandiose terms, in terms of not.
Okay, so unfortunately, I won't be able to respond to his last points. What I will say is that the abuse and the systematic government oppression of African Americans is relevant because we left the British government because of the unfair treatment, right? Inequality, unfair treatment of the colonies, right? So I think that to say that it is relevant completely ignores the context from which the nation was founded, the context from which the principles were based. So here's the distinction. He tries to say that I'm contradicting myself, even though the entire time he's been telling you that it's been based on tradition and then telling you, oh, by the way, all of our traditions are terrible and bad. So here's my distinction, right? When we look at our historical roots of protest, I am saying that to take the action of protest is American, not because necessarily it's something we have historically done, although we have historically done it. And what I am also saying is that because it is because we have historically done it, it is ingrained in our nature, but it is only an American action because it is supported by what this country was built off of, right? We protested, and then these are some of the ideals that we ingrained into our identity, right? So what I've told you today is, first, historically, yes, it is in our nature, and because it is in our nature, these are some of the ideals that we're founded on. This is part of the American identity. Secondly, I told you how they protested, right? He seems to brush away the idea that a peaceful protest matters. What I'm telling you is that when it is a peaceful protest, it actually doesn't infringe on anyone else's rights. It doesn't infringe on their rights to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. It also tells you, I also tell you about the fact that infringing, or the way they protest doesn't infringe on any respect towards the troops, any respect to the American identity that you might be seeing on a nationalistic scale, on a global scale. It doesn't hurt that. Lastly, I'm telling you, that are in the current system that they protest, right? It's one thing to protest. It's one thing to protest out in a way. He brings up the idea, can you use your free speech to be un-American? And what I'm telling you is they are not only using their free speech in a way that is American because using free speech is American, but the content of their claims is American because it protects citizens under the law equally. It stands out against abuse from the government. It abolishes unjust treatment under the law, which is what these ideals should lead up to, what they were founded from, and what we continue to reevaluate our identity every day and try to strive towards, even if we haven't always perfectly.
Well, big bummer. I missed literally all of your speech minus the last 20 seconds. I'm not sure what happened. I'll message you afterward and we'll figure something out. Technical difficulties are always a joy. But what I did here, I think, is insightful. My opponent is stepping in at the end and is saying, look, the speech that you're giving does protest government and it does protest injustice, and that's an American value. I just want to note that literally at any level, if you take my opponent's position, it's utterly regressive. This is the same argument I made before. There is actually no meaning to being pro-American or un-American if you say that, well, as long as you're protesting using freedom, I guess it has to be pro-America. It is impossible to oppose America. And what you're opposing doesn't make any sense either. Because after all, a communist stepping forward and saying democracy is the worst form of government ever, we need to tear down every statue of every American founder and literally let's get anarchy together. My opponent's saying, well, hey, look at them. They're protesting. They're resisting stuff. And that's all American to me. My opponent is making, what my opponent's done is he's made the definition of America so incredibly broad and so incredibly meaningless. Like literally any protest against injustice. I mean, Gandhi was pro-America. I mean, who cares if that, like literally any freaking Sparta is pro-American. After all, they resisted, they resisted the big government. They fought other nations at war. I mean, literally any interpretation my opponent's going to give you is going to say that, oh, another nation's pro-American or not. And this is the whole reason that I offer the definition. My opponent doesn't offer you a counter definition. He doesn't actually define it and argue why it's meaningful. He just says, well, in the past we supported freedom, so that has to be all American tradition is now. Look, I get the fact that we like to associate American ideals with freedom, and I get why that's appealing, but that's not a meaningful way to understand this resolution. If we want to talk meaningfully about what it means to be pro-American or un-American, we have to analyze what people are protesting versus not. And when someone is directly violating the tradition, which again, my opponent has never contested that it is a violation of the tradition. It's a violation of the flag protocol. It's a violation of literally what all of us are already familiar with, what we already do from time to time. You watch someone else who's, imagine went to the 4th of July and someone was like laying down on the ground during the anthem. Be like, bro, what are you doing? That's really disrespectful. We all understand that it's a violation of the tradition. My opponent has made the definition of American so broad to include morality or injustice, and then it said, well, there's some justice to be pro-American, or there's some freedom behind it, but that's not legitimate. It violates tradition. It violates the